Ladies and gentlemen, we'll call this hearing to order. We expect the arrival of some other senators soon when their conferences, lunches break up. But we welcome you all. Today, the Foreign Relations Committee is convened to discuss the crisis in Kosovo and its potential ramifications on stability throughout the region. Our first panel will consist of Ambassador Robert Gelbard, the Special Representative of the President and the Secretary of State for implementation of the Dayton Accords. After we hear from Ambassador Gelbard, the committee will welcome Mr. James Hooper from the Balkan Institute, Mr. John Fox of the Open Society Institute, and former Congressman Joseph DioGuardi, who currently is the volunteer president of the Albanian American Civic League. I appreciate the willingness of all of our witnesses to appear before the committee this afternoon. I confess that I'm deeply concerned about the situation in Kosovo today. Since February of this year, approximately 150 people have been killed in a particularly appalling fashion. And the Serbian police have attacked and murdered innocent women and children in their effort to crack down on the Kosovar Albanian separatist movement. The Albanian community in Kosovo has shown remarkable reserve in their pursuit of the autonomy that was revoked in 1989 and 90. But as we have all seen, that patience has worn thin. The gathering strength of the Kosovo Liberation Army in their quest for an independent Kosovo and their violent tactics to achieve their goals leads me to believe that things in Kosovo may yet get even worse. The Serbs have shown in recent months that they are more than willing to use overwhelming force in response to separatist activity in Kosovo. And I do not expect that that attitude to change. I sincerely hope that our administration does not consider President Milosevic's role in the Bosnian peace process, however great or small, as justification for leniency with regard to his abhorrent behavior in Kosovo. The contact group established to coordinate policy on the conflict in the former Yugoslavia has met several times since the violence in Kosovo broke out in February. Despite statements of outrage and condemnation from the contact group, the Serbs have continually ignored its limited demands. President Milosevic thus far has successfully exploited the historical and economic interests in Serbia that shade the views of some of our friends in Europe. Though there are merits to using the contact group in dealing with the situation in Kosovo, at some point in the future the contact group proves to be unsuccessful at contributing to the resolution of the conflict. Then the United States must pursue an appropriate policy unilaterally. I realize the policy challenges facing the United States and the international community in responding to the Kosovo crisis. Secretary of State Madeleine Albright has used strong words of warning to President Milosevic, but I must say the direction of the United States policy on this issue is unfortunately unclear. As I mentioned earlier, the contact group has been ineffective at forcing Mr. Milosevic to cease his terrorist tactics in Kosovo. Given the potential this conflict has to spread to the rest of the Balkans and beyond, even involving our NATO allies, Greece and Turkey, I think it is critical for the administration to clearly state its policy on this question. In December 1992, then President Bush delivered an unequivocal warning in a letter to President Milosevic that the United States was prepared to intervene militarily if Serbia attacked the ethnic Albanians in Kosovo. President Clinton repeated this so-called Christmas warning after he took office in 1993. It would serve the interests in furthering public debate on the issue if, Ambassador Gelbard, you will publicly state what this warning consists of and whether this will continue to be U.S. policy. I look forward to discussing these issues and other questions with all of our distinguished witnesses before us.
Serb special police, paramilitaries, were sent in to reinforce the local police in very large numbers and conduct a cleanup operation, as they called it. Supported by attack helicopters and heavy weapons, the operation lasted for a day. The total number killed by regular and special police was some 80 people, mostly non-combatants, including large numbers of children and women. Though the Serb and FRY governments describe this as a police action, no democratic country in the world would allow this kind of behavior by police to go unpunished. Since that time, the Belgrade government has tripled the number of special police, essentially paramilitary units or internal troops, as communist countries have called them in the past, deployed to Kosovo, and have recently deployed Yugoslav Army, VJ, infantry, armor, and artillery units on the borders and to key hotspots in the interior. This represents a substantial escalation, and the deployments on the border with Albania are particularly troubling. Nations do have a right to protect their borders. However, Belgrade's stated desire to prevent or stop cross-border weapons smuggling, carried out by small groups of people through remote mountain passes, does not track with the large-scale deployment of tanks and artillery to the border. Moreover, Belgrade has issued a threatening public statement accusing the government of Albania of conspiring to undermine the territorial integrity of the FRY. We in the contact group have warned the FRY against staging any cross-border operations into Albania or Macedonia. In response to Belgrade's use of excessive force and the lack of movement toward unconditional dialogue, the UN Security Council adopted on March 31st an arms embargo against the FRY, blocking planned arms purchases by Belgrade. This embargo also prohibits the sale or provision of weapons or other equipment or training for groups engaged in terrorist activities. Introduction of further weapons into the region, either to Belgrade or to extremist groups, will only increase the violence and make it more difficult to bring about negotiations and a political solution to the already bitter dispute over Kosovo's status. Even in the face of provocation, however, governments have a greater responsibility for ensuring that the rule of law is respected and the rights of its citizens protected than any armed extremist groups. Belgrade's failure and refusal to uphold that responsibility has made Kosovo an international problem. They are the ones who have internationalized Kosovo. And we and our allies have no intention of standing by and ignoring continued repression and escalation of violence into war.
Mr. Ambassador, before we hear from Senator Biden, I must ask you, is there a Christmas warning that is a policy of this government? And are there any steps being taken to implement that warning?
The United States continues to work on all possible options that are available regarding our desire to find a peaceful solution in Kosovo. All options are on the table and available. We have not ruled anything out. President Milosevic is well aware of that.
Seems to me that history shows that Mr. Milosevic will respond to force, and that force used early may well prevent a great deal of difficulty later, as we've learned in Bosnia. I just wonder if perhaps we ought to be more visible with preparations backing up a Christmas warning.
Well, first, President Milosevic and his government, I think, are very well aware of U.S. government policy overall on all these issues. And as I said, we continue to be prepared to exercise every avenue possible to try to find a way to get a peaceful solution. I fully agree with what you said in your opening statement, Mr. Chairman, about the way this appalling situation has escalated. In my frequent visits to Belgrade and to Pristina over the last several months, I have been trying, and representatives of other governments have been trying, to make every effort to bring the two sides together. We are continuing to do so, and we continue to try to find every way possible to get this to happen. There are some sensitive aspects to U.S. policy, and I'd be happy to talk with you and other members of the Senate privately about some of these.
We're about to hear from a very distinguished former congressperson and a person who is at this present status is a spokesperson for Albanians in the diaspora, Albanian Americans here, and ostensibly others as well. Congressman, welcome.
Nice to be here, Senator. I recall being here in this very position facing you on, I guess it was February 1991, just over 7 years ago, when you were concerned, really concerned about what was going to happen in Yugoslavia. And I remember ending that testimony by saying that I didn't think that Yugoslavia was going to stay together. We're all hoping that it would. The United States was banking its foreign policy on it. And all we heard during that meeting was how Albanian terrorists and separatists and the quest for greater Albania was going to destroy Yugoslavia. And now we see what destroyed Yugoslavia, which was there all the time, the quest for greater Serbia. Slobodan Milosevic, when he walked in to Kosova in 1987 and brutally occupied it and took away its legitimate status as one of the 8 juridical units of the Confederal Republic of Yugoslavia, where Kosovo had an equal vote with Serbia. It rotated every year. Created, in less than a few years, not only apartheid, but a Warsaw ghetto that still exists in the heart of Europe today. I wouldn't be concerned, Senator, about greater Albania. I'd be concerned that we've already legitimized ethnic cleansing by creating a phony republic called Srpska. It never existed. It's there. Why? Because Slobodan Milosevic wanted it. The person who in the news last Sunday is targeted by his former friend, Karadzic, in a book saying he's about to now go to Hague, and he's going to turn state's evidence, and he's pointing the finger at his friend Slobodan Milosevic as the architect of some of the most brutal, unbelievable atrocities since the Nazi era. We don't have to worry about greater Albania. We have to worry about what I was worried about back in February of 1991. And at that time, I can only wave in front of you a Serbian version of this. I'm now going to give you the English translation. This is what Slobodan Milosevic has been weaned on. Here it is, The Expulsion of the Albanians, a paper presented by his mentor, a professor, former minister of the Yugoslav government, Vasil Tribilovic, in Belgrade, March 7, 1937. If you want to see what happened in Bosnia, what's happening in Kosovo today, read word for word, line by line, exactly what's going on, their MO, their modus operandi. Shelling villages, burning them down, getting rid of Albanians at all costs, because this is territory they want. He will not abandon this. And as we keep waffling in this body and in the State Department, he will just go and take more and more and more and more. He bluffed his way right through Bosnia, and he got Srpska. He's bluffing his way right now. He knows that there's no real resolve with this Christmas warning. Mr. Chairman, thank you for this hearing. Sorry to start before you walked in. But he sees and senses the waffling already. He sees strong words on the part of Madeleine Albright. Then Madeleine Albright is muffled by Sandy Berger. And then we have questions coming up in Gilman's hearing a few weeks ago about the Christmas warning and a very lukewarm response by Ambassador Gelbard. We have to meet with you in executive session, and you heard it again today. No direct response. Don't you think Slobodan Milosevic is hearing those responses? Don't you think he's ready to do more and more because he sees that the greatest superpower in the world has lost its resolve, has a foreign policy which has abandoned the principles upon which this country was formed? Our foreign policy should be based on fundamental human rights. That's one of the key determinants of foreign policy. We have today in Kosova some of the most egregious examples of violations of those human rights. In fact, Senator Biden, during that hearing that you held, and it was a wonderful hearing, it was the first time that you got all groups together to talk about the problem, I had to fly in reports from the Council on Human Rights from Pristina and other places, litanies of horror. I don't have to do that today. You know why? All you have to do is read your own U.S. country report from the State Department. Here it is, the 1997 edition. But if you read the last 5 years, you can't believe the litany of horrors in here against the Albanian people of Kosova. What are we waiting for? How many people have been killed and brutally tortured and detained and disappeared? Every criteria they use has been violated. Why is there such a disconnect between those egregious violations and our professed adherence to human rights when it comes to foreign policy? Is there another deal in the wind? Perhaps you didn't ask the right questions to Ambassador Gelbard. Are we placating Russia for some reason? They're always there supporting their first cousins, the Serbs. That's where the Serbs came from in the 6th century AD, from the Ukraine. We know they're blood brothers, or at least blood cousins. They're always there supporting them. But what has Russia done for us in Iran, Iraq, and China, and so many other places? They don't support us. Why are we giving such deference to Russia? Why are we even considering a contact group at this point, including Russia? This is an issue that should be led by the United States of America in the NATO milieu, without Russia. This is where it belongs. That is what solved Bosnia. And the only reason today Bosnia is not like Kosova, Mr. Chairman and Senator, is that we have troops there. Who are we kidding? When are we going to wake up? Another key element of our foreign policy that's been abandoned is that we will do everything to preserve the security of a vital area like the Balkans in Europe. And if you look at international law and how it defines where you have a state of belligerency, you look at what the neighboring countries are saying about what's going on there. Every one of them is using language which is at the edge. Recently, the foreign minister of Greece said Kosovo is like a hand grenade. If it goes any further, it's going to explode. A Turkish spokesman of the foreign policy said something similar. I have it right here someplace. Stated that the Kosovo crisis, if unchecked, could destabilize the Balkan region and therefore European security. NATO condemned the excessive use of force by the Yugoslav army in Kosovo and said that the North Atlantic Council is profoundly concerned about the deterioration of the situation there and was considering, quote, possible further means to maintaining stability in view of the risk of escalating the conflict in the region. On April 27th, a spokesman from the United States State Department said that if the contact group members did not agree to a new sanctions package, the United States would act unilaterally. The United States reiterated the UN and the contact group's call for the immediate withdrawal of the special police units, which are nothing more than the Yugoslav army from Kosovo, and the need for unconditional dialogue. And yet, when the contact group met in Rome on April 29th, the United States capitulated to a weak proposal for more sanctions under pressure, especially from Russia, which, as I said before, has gone out of its way not to support us in dealing with Iran, Iraq, China, and many other areas. It is obvious that the sanctions are not really an issue to Belgrade, which has already survived 6 years of very tough economic sanctions. In the meantime, How many Kosovar Albanians have to be killed? We talk about negotiations. We talk about so many things. No conditions. But when do we get to the point where we say, hey, thousands of Albanians are being killed? Are these negotiations working? Should we now learn from the experience we had in Bosnia that Slobodan Milosevic only understands one thing, and that's the use of force or the threat thereof? In the meantime, they will only serve, these sanctions will only serve to bolster nationalistic fervor on Mr. Milosevic's behalf. Only resolve will work, Mr. Chairman, and that will have to come from the only superpower left in the world, the United States of America, taking the lead with our NATO allies. In conclusion, the 2 million ethnic Albanians of Kosovo, who comprise more than 90% of the population there, have no human, economic, or political rights of any kind. Slobodan Milosevic has illegally and brutally occupied Kosovo now for almost 10 years. I'm not going to go through the history of Kosovo, but I have a 3-page addendum to my testimony, and by the way, I'd like to offer the entire testimony for the record. I'm giving an abbreviated form of it.
Happy to receive it.
But when you look at Kosovo, it's not a new story. Kosovo was part of Albania until 1916 and 17, as was that population of Albanians in Macedonia and southeastern Montenegro. That's why they're all contiguous. The line was if you drew the line around 7 million Albanians today, you have the former state of Albania that came out of Turkish occupation. They're not looking to change those borders. The only one looking to change borders is Slobodan Milosevic. What they want is some peace in their lives, some self-determination, some ability to raise their families, to be who they want to be, and to save their national identity. And what we see right now is ethnic cleansing all over again in Kosovo, the way we saw at Bosnia. It's time for our State Department to understand that loose talk that brands the victims as terrorists for defending themselves, their families, their property, and I'll even add their sacred honor. It's important to Albanians the way it was important to our founding fathers, Mr. Chairman and Senator. This only serves to give the green light to the real terrorist, Slobodan Milosevic and his henchmen, who are massacring innocent people as we sit here speaking. It is time for the United States to stand up for its own principles and demand compliance with international human rights conventions before more Albanians are needlessly slaughtered and a new Balkan war is triggered, this time involving neighboring Albania, Greece, Macedonia, Bulgaria, and Turkey. It is time for Congress to stand up and voice its outrage at a foreign policy in the Balkans that has obviously failed to preserve peace and security in this vital region of the world. It is time for the United States to back up its tough words with concrete actions, such as declaring a no-fly zone in Kosovo, as we did in Bosnia. What is wrong with that? They're using these heavily armed helicopters right now to level villages. 2, ringing Serbia's border with NATO troops and moving an aircraft carrier off the coast of Montenegro. These actions would not only reaffirm our resolve to stop the escalation of the conflict in Kosovo, but I believe would lead to a lasting peace for the Albanian people and all ethnic groups in the Balkans. I would like to also give to the record, Mr. Chairman, a book that I prepared a few years ago called The Agony of Kosovo. It's a good reference book. It has 3 pages of index material because it shows what this body has done since 1987, this body in the House. And it shows that what we're talking about here today is nothing new. It's just escalating, and our foreign policy is nothing new. We're still waffling. What we did in Bosnia, for some reason, we're reluctant to do in Kosovo. And when we talk about the Albanian people as fundamentalists and terrorists, let's not forget what my good friend Ben Gilman did a couple of years ago at the Holocaust Museum in memorializing the Albanian people, the state of Albania, as the only nation in Europe that didn't give one Jew to the Nazis. That's now part of the Yad Vashem in Israel and our museum here. And this book was written by an American Jew, to memorialize that fact, and I want to leave you the letter that Ben Gilman sent to members of this body in the House to say that. It's a shame that we cannot do something to save these people, these terrorist groups that come from Belgrade, special police that are really criminals let out of jail, and they're given police uniforms and army uniforms, running into homes. They know that the Albanian people save their money usually with gold. They're going there to get bounty, to get currency. They killed the families on the spot in Drenica. How many women and children were killed in their living rooms and bedrooms? We're still not allowed to go there. There is a mass grave someplace. We have testimony from the women. They heard their men and their husbands and young sons screaming. They were taken away, 200. There's a mass grave there someplace. We'll find it sooner or later, as we did in Bosnia. But what are we waiting for? Is this the United States that we want to represent? A country that stands on the side as a brutal dictator with state-inspired terrorism, brutalizes a group of 2 million people who are defenseless today in Kosova. And what's wrong with a national liberation movement, Senator, when there's no one there to defend you? What's wrong with that? What are they going to wait for? There are many articles written about when enough is enough. And there was one just recently that I read by a professor from Tufts University. His name is Hurst Honden. And he said there are 2 instances in which secession, not saying that they're saying that, but even secession, as we did 221 years ago, should be supported by the international community. The first occurs when massive, discriminatory human rights violations approaching the scale of genocide are being perpetrated. If there is no likelihood of a change in the attitude of the central government, or if the majority population supports the repression, as we just saw in that phony referendum that Slobodan Milosevic just held in Serbia, he doesn't want any international intervention, secession may be the only effective remedy for the besieged group. This is international law. A second possible exception might find a right of secession if reasonable demands for local self-government or minority rights have been arbitrarily rejected by a central government, even without accompanying large-scale violence. And it goes on. So this is not an easy issue. It wasn't easy in 1991. It's not easy today. But let's not brand the victims as the terrorists. Let's not talk about Greater Albania, because that's not on the table. What's on the table constantly for 50 years, certainly in the last 10, is the quest for Greater Serbia, and we seemed very willing to give Mr. Milosevic what he wants. I hope we're not going to do the same in Kosova as we did in Bosnia. It would be a tragedy of the highest proportions, and I think would only lead to a very destabilized Balkans and a greater war later on. Thank you.
Thank you, gentlemen, all of you. I must confess I'm uncertain as to what the policy of the administration is in terms of a Christmas message and what, if anything, we're doing to prepare to enforce such a policy. I hope to find out some answers myself on that, whether private or otherwise. But the Congressman has laid out some specific proposals that we declare a no-fly zone, ring the area with NATO troops, and park a aircraft carrier off the coast. I wonder if either of you two would care to comment on that, how long it would be, how effective it would be, and whether we ought to be doing it unilaterally or involving all of NATO, and what spillover there might be towards peacekeeping in Bosnia.
Senator, I think that the only way to, there's a lot of dissension now within NATO, and I think that's because the United States, the Clinton administration, has been unwilling to exercise proper leadership on this issue. What I think we are advocating, what Congressman DioGuardi is advocating, is conflict prevention, the kind of military measures that are credible enough to prevent the kind of conflict that will require even greater military measures, greater risks, greater burdens, or more disastrous consequences if we don't react.
Congressman has raised the issue, the overlay of Russia's influence on Serbia or alliance with Serbia, and I wonder if you either of you have a comment on that. What do you think, how does that impact the American action?
I think the refusal of the administration to take this to NATO has quite a bit to do with that fact. And in fact, I think some of our European allies are putting a higher priority on keeping Russia as part of a lowest common denominator diplomatic effort than they are to really facing up to the fundamentals here. Russia has not been friendly to peaceful outcomes in the Balkans and the southern Balkans. I think it would be better for the administration to question why Russia insists on collecting war criminals and pariahs as its clients at this late date, and why they can't find some other Serbs to ally themselves with. There's a difference between a pro-Serb policy and a pro-Serbs policy. There are a lot of Serbs, there are a lot of moderate Serbs. There's not just one Serb or one handful of Serbs. And I think a good deal could be done to remind Moscow of that. I think it would be more credible still if the U.S. Had a record of supporting democratic forces in the former Yugoslavia, which it decidedly does not. We tend to take it as it lays and then wonder why there's no Lech Walesa or Václav Havel.
Here's my question, and this is to you, Congressman, is in terms of where you think, if you have to pick a horse here, do you suggest that we, the United States, use all our influence and whatever force we're willing to use to deal with and promote and support the Democratic League of Kosovo or the Kosovo Liberation Army? Because right now, they ain't in tandem.
Why don't we make the question a lot more simple? Why don't we look at international law, look at a population of 2 million people that is being brutalized every day?
Because it's useful to look at reality.
Well, but reality is also, Senator, that you raised the issue of, well, who is this George Washington that we want to find in Belgrade so we can solve the problem? We may have to wait a long time. But in the meantime,
I agree.
We cannot let these people be brutalized and killed every day. I think there are things we have to do right now.
And
we have to face Slobodan Milosevic in the eye, as we did in Bosnia, and say, get every one of those VJ troops out of Kosova. And if you don't do it, we're going to take some action. Now,
What action? We're going to bomb,
action?
right?
What are we
Use
doing?
physical force.
Yeah, but wait a minute.
I'm not saying yes, we shouldn't. I want to know what
you
action
just
he's
said
talking
before, the arguments you made before, the same arguments that I heard I was on a panel with Bob Torricelli and Senator McCain back in 1992 or 3 or 4 in the McLaughlin show, and they were saying the same thing. But we did something, didn't we? We waited 3 years. Sooner or later, we got the resolve motif, and we said something has to be done.
No,
Why is this any different?
Well, no, it is different because, no, it's not different. I just want to know what you suggest, because back then, when I was in your position, I was suggesting we bomb Belgrade. I was suggesting that we send American pilots in and blow up all the bridges on the Drina. I was suggesting we take out his oil supplies. I was suggesting very specific action.
And isn't it interesting that we didn't have to go that far to begin the solution in Bosnia?
Isn't it interesting that about 200,000 people were killed in the meantime by the time they did it?
Yes, and that's going to happen in Kosovo.
That's why I want to know what you're suggesting now.
What we have to do right now is to enforce international law. We have war criminals in Belgrade. We're dealing with one right now. I said that article before. I have a copy of it right here. Here it is. It was in the Gannett papers on Sunday. There's Slobodan Milosevic, side by side Mr. Karadzic, who's now got a book coming out pointing the finger at him for all these atrocities in Bosnia. Why aren't we picking him up?
Because the French, he's in the French quarter, and the French let him walk around. That's why.
It seems to me that we've got a double standard here. If we're going to be the great United States of America, standing up for oppressed people, and I believe we can do that without sending military all over the world, let's pick up the war criminals in Belgrade. We know who they are. We know where they are. And number two, let's tell Mr. Milosevic, get every troop out of there. You know why? It's not because we want him to, because we like it. He is now on the brink of creating a Balkan war. You know the problems we have between Greece and Turkey. You know how fragile Macedonia is. You know that we right now have 600 troops on the border in Macedonia. What are we waiting for? If he keeps doing this, all he's doing is raising the temperature, and as the Greek foreign minister said, the hand grenade will explode and the Balkans will explode. We have no choice. Let's do something now than have to do 20 times more later on.
The purpose of calling this hearing was simply to focus the debate and get some minds to working. Part of the role of the U.S. Senate is advising, not just consenting. And hopefully we have the attention of our government, and we can stimulate some resolve. So we thank you all for participating. And with that, we are adjourned.
Take a quick look at that.